both of them were people who had lost their families, who had lost the connections of language and land and society.
Difficult for me to comprehend what it's like to have a big family because they were all killed.
My mother may have had a childhood, but I wasn't to know of it, because whenever, I think it's understandable, whenever she would think about Vienna, or whenever she would think of her parents, or whenever she would think of her school days, it would bring back how she was involuntarily thrust out of all that she was forced to leave, and all those people she lost, and all those people who were deported and exterminated.
I think one of the hardest things in growing up to deal with for me personally was knowing that my dad had children that were killed during the war. It was never talked about, but I can remember sometimes thinking about what they must be like if I measured up, if I were like them, if we were very different. And there was almost like a conspiracy of silence going around that particular issue in particular. My parents tell me very little about their experiences during the war, virtually nothing. And my father died before I was really of an age old enough where I had the curiosity to really ask him questions. I was 11 when he died. And my mother really never spoke about it, although they spoke about it a great deal with their friends, and I would overhear and pick up bits and pieces of information. So I'm not sure that what I know is real or whether I filled in the missing pieces or not.
My mother didn't really talk as much about the Holocaust as my father did, and I'm not exact. If you asked her a question, she'd give you an answer. But you know, she wasn't big on volunteering information, and I don't particularly know why. Although lately, as she has, and maybe as we have gotten older, she is a lot more free with the information. And I got a feeling it's because she may be a little more conservative than my father and thought that we weren't old enough for something like that, and maybe it wasn't right.
There's an interesting story when I first showed my father the galleys of the book. I was real nervous because all of the growth that I was doing in terms of dealing with the Holocaust in my life, I had done separate. I was afraid. I think I was afraid that they wouldn't understand, that it wouldn't compare to their struggle. I'm not quite sure. But I showed the book first to my mother, and she read it and was obviously profoundly moved. And then she said, "Hans, sit down in the living room and read this book." And he did, at least a good portion of it. And I was nervous in the other room, biting my nails, and I guess about an hour or two later, he came up to me and he sat down and had tears in his eyes and said that he'd never realized that the Holocaust had had such an impression on me. That my parents had tried to build a home environment so that I wouldn't be affected, so that I wouldn't feel that pain. And he realized then that that wasn't possible to do, that it ran too deeply, but that it also had positive effects, that it brought us closer.
During the past year, I was severely ill, and it gave me an opportunity to spend a lot of time with my mom and dad, and a couple interesting things happened during that period. I read a book which pointed out some common traits of survivors, and started to talk to my folks about it and found out that it was true for them as well, and they hadn't really realized it, and helped me and them work through the issues of my illness. Particularly was, since I was a namesake for both of my grandfathers, and neither had been mourned properly, when I became ill, there was some mourning unconscious mourning for the grandparents, as well as concern for me. And as I started to recover, the ritual mourning still continued for a long while until it had gotten out of their systems.
When my mother died, 2 years ago, I think one of the greatest regrets I had was the fact that I never really had an opportunity to discuss with her her past as an adult, where I could really integrate the information and assimilate it in a way that would be important for me to pass on to my kids.
I definitely think that the grandchildren of the survivors and the grandchildren of everybody ought to know what it was like, because the people in the United States were out there getting killed too, fighting a war, and it was no picnic. I think that she ought to know so that she's better able to understand a little bit about her heritage, and she's better able to understand a little bit about her grandparents. It's difficult for me to comprehend what it's like to have a big family, because they were all killed. And I don't understand what it's like to have grandparents and aunts and uncles and the rest of that stuff.
It seems that the families of children of survivors are characterized by a particular intensity. Emotions are strained or perhaps more extreme, both the very happy ones as well as the sad ones. And that one can easily understand that if one speculates back to the enormity of losses, of trauma that the parents suffered, that everything becomes much more heightened. And that perhaps subconsciously, much of what to you would appear to be an everyday interaction has some connection or meaning to the Holocaust.
Both of them were so afraid to lose that they overprotected me. They just couldn't stand to lose a child or lose any of the health of that child or the education of the child, so they hovered over me very carefully.
Going away to college was something that I never considered. And it's interesting, my mother never said to me, you can't go away. But I always knew that going away to school was going to be something that she was really going to get crazy over. I always felt with my mom, a little more so than with my dad, that her entire life was invested in me, that I was what gave her meaning. It was, sometimes it made me angry because I couldn't be everything she wanted me to be for her.
I think you can imagine what it means to be someone who lost everything because she was a Jew, have her son do everything as a Jew, to become a professional in the Jewish community, and to meet with Jews and be with Jews and work on behalf of Jews and work with Jews, may on some level have worried her that what almost killed her could one day come back to hurt me.
I remember one childish tantrum that I had when my father was in his room following a big blow-up, and he was crying, and he said in German to my mother, and my ear was glued to the wall, and I heard it. Oh, I don't know why I went through it all. There was nothing that I could have heard or thought that could have stung me more than that. And that fear that they would even consider that it wasn't worthwhile for them to have survived the Holocaust.
He was sent to Auschwitz, I think, first off, right away, first stop. And from what he's told me, when he got there, it wasn't a very pleasant place to be. I don't think he fully comprehended the situation when he was there. He said even the ride over there on the cattle cars, people were dying in the car, and there was hundreds of people shoved into one little car, and they were all over each other, and they had no food, no water.
My mother was one of two children. Surprisingly, both survived, where my father, all five of his brothers and his one sister did not survive. She ended up, I don't know exactly how, but in a concentration camp called Sabiba. And Sabiba, while not well known, because it was liberated or actually closed down before the Russians got to it, as opposed to some of the German camps where the Americans or the Allies had freed it, was one of the larger camps. Poland was the center of the Orthodox Jewish population of the world, and several million people went through Sabeba. It has the largest death toll of any of the concentration camps.
He must have been somewhere around 17, 18 when he got into the camp. And of course, he was one of the younger people there at the time. He said at the end of the war, he was probably the oldest.
In the concentration camp, my father became engaged to a woman who was later killed in the war. But my father himself fled. He was informed that he would soon be shipped east, probably to Auschwitz or Treblinka, and then managed to escape by hiding himself in a laundry container or something.
The Germans would pull fake liberations. And they'd say, you're all free to go, run. And then they'd set up guns and shoot everybody. And he had promised some guy that he knew that he would take care of his kid. I don't know how old the kid was. I don't know how old the other guy was either. So when they said everybody run, the kid that he was supposed to take care of, I guess, was too small or whatever, and my dad grabbed this boy and pulled him along with and ran. And apparently while he was running, the kid got shot. He told me he didn't know the guy got shot until he was about 4 miles later. You know, he was just concerned with running and keeping this kid with him. Somebody ran by him and said, he's dead, let him go. And he wouldn't let him go.
There was a group of individuals, about 90 or so, that were kept as prisoners who were staff and attended to the various things, attended to the gardens, were workers in the camp. Not all of them were shipped off to the gas chambers. My mother was one of these workers and held a large number of very unusual kinds of jobs, raising rabbits, which they use for experimental purposes, and to test whether gas chambers were working.
If you ask anybody that survived, that was in a concentration camp, especially a death camp, their answer uniformly is, I don't know. I don't know why, you know, my family died and I didn't. I don't know how I lived through it, I just did.
The fear or the concern about them having to have done something immoral or unethical or really dehumanized, I didn't want to know that my parents were actually involved. You know, it's one thing to read about it in a book, it's another thing to relate it to your parents.
Morality is a function of the times, and survival and what that can cause people to do is difficult for me to judge, not having been in that situation, and so the morality of those times are not the morality of these times. I suspect nothing happened, and I don't care to know whether I'm right or wrong.
And what I try very much to do is to try to put myself in the shoes of a German non-Jew. For example, every Yom Kippur, I read a book by Hildegard Zassenhaus called Walls. It's the story of a young Christian woman living in the Third Reich, working as a translator, and through the ability that she had to first translate documents and then to bring vitamins into prisoners, she saved the lives of 1,100 Norwegian and other Scandinavian prisoners. And I wonder if I would have had the courage to do that. I wonder, especially all those little people who helped her, who watched her carry in those vitamins, or who noticed that her bag was bulging, or that she was keeping strange hours or something like that. How much would I have been able to do to help others who were victims when I myself was in a relatively safe position?
If you really think about the Holocaust, you'll find out that you can't. In other words, what occurred there is so incomprehensible that you really can't think about it in any kind of objective terms, because you've got to realize that literally millions of people were murdered, okay? And they were murdered in an assembly line fashion. Nobody, including myself, that grows up in the United States can possibly imagine that happening.
Yet I have to try And one of the reasons is because I have some concerns that if people don't keep it up front, and it's not an issue that's discussed, it could happen again. And I don't think that's really an idle threat when you see a lot of activity by the KKK, all kinds of people starting to talk about deserting Israel, deserting Jews. The Holocaust can't happen, but I work a lot in affirmative action, and I see a lot of the same kinds of things happening to lots of folks. Currently, with the boat people, how that's in a microcosm of what happened to the Jews. And as most of the civilized Western world stands by and says, we have no room for them, it makes me insecure and know that it could happen again.
It was a very strange feeling being in Germany. The Germans were just like my parents. They spoke like my parents, they made gestures like my parents, they had little habits, customs, priorities. They were my parents all over. It was like all these people were my family, and I felt very close to them, but I also held back because I knew that they, or at least many of them among these Germans, were responsible for the death of my extended family.
I've been to a number of war crime trials, to be specific. I guess why I went is a combination of reasons. I was starting to deal with my own lack of awareness of my heritage or what had happened, filling in some gaps, getting some information, and it just seemed an opportunity that I shouldn't let slip. As well as my mother wanted to go and she needed some support when she was there. The trial itself was interesting. Facts came to me, or information that I suspect I would have never gotten any other way.
In terms of desire to go back to my parents' hometowns, first of all, my father's hometown no longer exists. And my mother's from a big city, so that town is still there. No, I don't. I may have when I was a kid, just to see what it was they were talking about, but it would be a totally different thing than what they had. They remember it as they left it, and I'm sure that now it's nowhere near what it was. First of all, there's no Jews.
I arrived in the airport in Vienna and went to a tourist bureau that arranged rooms for people. By coincidence, they put me in what at one time was the Jewish neighborhood, the 9th district, which, as it turns out, was where my mother had lived. But I didn't know what the name Alserstrasse, the name of the street, reminded me of something. I didn't know what it was. And when I started to unpack, looked in my journal, and there it was, Alserstrasse. And I checked the number of my pension, and the number of the address was just a block and a half away. And I, at that moment, just left the pension and ran up the street, and I stood facing the apartment building that my mother had lived in from age 5 or 6 up to her late 20s when she left. Every morning when I got up, before I started seeing the city for that day, I made a pilgrimage to that building. I mean, it was a strange feeling, and I knew there was something very obsessive about it, but I felt this need to go and stand on the corner and look at that building. And one day, I went in, and the way these buildings are built is the courtyard is in the center, and a shared common courtyard, and I entered, and I stood in the courtyard, and I looked at the stairs, and should I or shouldn't I, and I went up the stairs, and I stood opposite the door of what had been her apartment. I just didn't know whether to knock or not, and I didn't. As curious as I was to see how it had changed, I knew that at this point I was intruding on somebody else's life, and it would be unfair to force my past on their present reality. But I had that feeling about standing opposite the building each day, about standing opposite parks and open-air markets and schools that she went to. I traveled to these addresses and just stood and looked, and somehow what welled up in me was sadness that I was back, even though I had never been there before. I really felt like I had returned, and I was alive, and I was saying to this Vienna of 1975, I survived, I'm a Jew, I've come back. My mother wouldn't do that, but in this vicarious, obsessive sort of way, I came back and stood there to witness there for her.